This is the last lecture I'm giving in this first week, and I want to take this opportunity to revisit some of the things we've talked about and draw some of the conclusions out of some of the ideas that I've been talking about this week. If you were to read the academic literature, certainly if you were to read the newspaper and I would imagine listen to the last 9 lectures I've given, one might be feeling somewhat depressed about the future of the Pacific Islands, that the sun might go down but not come up again. And I want to try and build on what I've said and recapture that to build a case for perhaps a slightly more optimistic view of this problem. I'll make 5 points. Just to recap, that to say, first of all, that all the Pacific Islands are not alike and vulnerability varies quite widely across the region, within countries and even within villages. There's different levels of exposure. Think about this map. Now, cyclones are generated along the equator to the east of the Pacific and tend to travel in a southerly and easterly direction. So not every country in the region is particularly affected by cyclones. Some are much more affected than others. Exposure varies quite differently too, according to problems such as drought. Now, El Nino doesn't cause drought in a uniform way across the region. Rainfall patterns vary across the region, and they even vary within islands according to the effects of orography and so on. There are regional climate patterns like the Intertropical Convergence Zone. There are long-term climate trends like ENSO and the Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation that all mean that exposure to climate change varies quite widely, in fact, across the region. And of course, sea level rise will have different kinds of impacts depending on the nature of the coast and elevation and so on. Sensitivity to climate change varies quite widely too, according to economies and livelihoods, according to who's get jobs and so on. Think about food, whether people are buying their food or whether they're growing it or whether they're getting most of their food from fishing. If they're getting most of their food from fishing, do they get it from the reefs or do they get it from the oceans? The price of food, the kinds of crops that are grown, the kinds of soil that they're grown in, the kinds of fish that are eaten all vary, and those different kinds of food supply are all to various degrees sensitive or not to climate change. Even things like building designs vary quite widely, what a house is made of, whether it's elevated or not, and so on. And of course, as explained quite recently, adaptive capacity varies quite widely too. So, we've already talked about this, but I think the point to say here is that to say that the Pacific Islands are vulnerable is quite problematic. There is no uniformity. And if we can begin to understand that some of the reasons why vulnerability varies are for social reasons, if we begin to look at the social drivers of vulnerability, then we begin to have a slightly different idea about the nature of this problem and perhaps a slightly more optimistic idea about solutions. So my second point here is to say that vulnerability isn't just about exposure to climate risks. If it were, Singapore would be as vulnerable as Samoa, or Hong Kong would be as vulnerable as Tuvalu, but they're not. Many of the determinants of vulnerability are not about nature. There's nothing natural or inevitable about them. They're socially produced. It's about social processes, about the nature of economies, how economies are established, how people invest in economies. It's about jobs and who gets them, and what it takes to get them. It's about the distribution of land. It's about access to healthcare. It's about the provision of education. It's about the nature of urban planning systems. It's about the nature of all sorts of governance systems and about the distribution and access to all sorts of social opportunities that mean that some people are more vulnerable than others, about gender and so on. So in theory, these very powerful social drivers of vulnerability can be managed through social systems. In theory, if it is social systems, if it's our economies and the institutions that distribute social opportunities that make vulnerability, then it's within the control of social systems to unmake the social drivers of vulnerability, to make it right, to make it fair, to reduce vulnerability. Easier said than done, but an important principle to remember. Vulnerability to climate change in the Pacific Islands is only partly about the environment, is only partly about nature, and very much about society. So this means 2 things. We can control it, And secondly, if vulnerability is not only about exposure but about social things, then adaptation shouldn't only be thought about as about reducing exposure. It's not just about building seawalls, and it's not just about trying to move people. They are easy options and they're lazy options. They're not particularly fair or democratic options. They're not particularly smart options. They're not really good options, actually, in many cases. In fact, adaptation involves a whole bunch of quite hard, detailed things that require a lot of hard thinking and a lot of hard work about access to education, healthcare, town planning, building better water systems, building better energy systems, better forms of coastal management, better forms of disaster risk management. And climate change people and climate change policy people kind of yawn and go, oh, that's boring, that's not adaptation. That is actually adaptation. And it does mean that climate change adaptation isn't so different in many cases from sustainable development and economic development and processes to promote human development. Climate change in this sense is not an exceptional policy problem. It's about doing things better within existing policy and institutional processes. My third point, which I have already expanded on, is that we probably are underestimating adaptive capacity in the Pacific Islands. And this is a really good example. This is a village called Navala in Fiji. It's the only village in Fiji, they say, that is still built out of traditional thatch housing. Beautiful housing, wonderful. This housing doesn't get blown over in cyclones. It flexes with the wind and it moves around. It's not a hard structure. And if it does get damaged, it can be rebuilt using local materials in a fairly short period of time using the pooled labour of the village. Now, everybody wants a modern house with brick walls and a modern ceiling, but maybe that's not the kind of house that is most adaptable to climate change. Maybe these are. Maybe the people in the village of Navala know something or remember something that is being lost. But this is the old housing style. This is the housing style that people always did and that people knew to do, in part because it works. And you can find all these traditional practices across the Pacific about how to maintain fresh water strings, about how to sustainably manage reef fisheries, about how to ensure a fair distribution of natural resources across a society using systems of kinship and governance and so on. The knowledge for adaptation exists. It's been proven historically to be effective, and to some degree at least, under moderate rates of climate change, is likely to be effective again. So recognising this adaptive capacity that exists and looking at what is there, not trying to find what isn't there, helps us think a little bit differently about this. It helps us to be perhaps a little bit more optimistic about the ability of people in the Pacific Islands to respond to climate change. And it helps us think about adaptation as being less about providing things that were never there, trying to make them rich, but trying to give them freeways and trying to build on existing capabilities and strengths. This is a shot inside these traditional houses in Navala. They're very cool in summer, very warm in winter. Very nice places to spend the day drinking kava. Okay, a fourth thing I want to talk about here is about time. And the way we've thought about climate change is very much as a spatial problem, about doing things in space. Yet the information we get about climate change, the information we get from climate impact science, compresses time and does funny things to the way we think about time. Think about the estimates of sea level rise, 88 centimetres by 2100. Well, that's 80-something years away. And 88 centimetres sounds like an awful lot if suddenly you were to wake up tomorrow morning and find the sea level had risen by 88 centimetres. That would be a problem, and it would be very hard to adapt to. But if sea level is rising progressively over 88 years, what happens between now and then? What decisions do we make today to deal with the problem of sea level rise in 10 years' time or 20 years' time? What's it going to look like in 20 years' time? And what decisions might we make in 20 years' time to help adapt to the next 20 years of sea level rise and so on? We've really compressed time in our understanding of climate science, and it has a number of very unhelpful effects on the way we think about this problem of climate change in Pacific Islands. The second is it doesn't really help us plan progressively for the sequence of things, for the way things unfold. We really have no imagination of what to do. In Victoria, we have a policy that says local governments, Victoria and Australia, must adapt, must plan for sea level rise of 80 centimetres by 2100. as if the solution to 80 centimetres of sea level rise must be found and implemented and solved now. In no other policy area do we say, we anticipate a risk in 100 years' time, solve that problem now. Yet we're sort of doing that in sea level rise. And we're getting this message that, well, there's going to be 88 centimetres of sea level rise in the Pacific and changes in El Nino and rainfall and everything else. It's bad. Yeah, it's bad. It's bad in 100 years' time, but what about between now and then? There's an implication too then about a very bad distant future. It makes us think that this is a hopeless issue. It makes us give up hope. It makes us go, wow, the forces of nature are large. In the long run, it's bad. And this changes people's thinking. I've heard aid agencies say, what's the point in investing in that country, in a desalinisation plant there? It's a bad investment. The country isn't going to be there in the future. So, well, when is it not going to be there? Tell me when that is. How do you calculate the return on your investment if you don't know when this hypothetical future is going to end? So it changes the way people think. Now, there's a very good analogy here. Think about your life. When you're born, and at some point in your life, maybe, around about the age of 10, let's say, it'll occur to you that you're going to die. That death is actually inevitable. What do you do? Do you go, I'll kill myself now? You don't. You try and plan for your life. You try and live your life in a meaningful, dignified way. Governments do this too. Governments don't decide the birth of that child, that's an economically bad investment because sooner or later, everything we're going to invest in that child is going to be wasted because it's going to die. So why do we say this about islands? Why do we say there may be some point in the future for the Pacific Islands, for a country like Tuvalu, where it might be difficult for people to live there, where ultimately in 100 years or 150 years' time, it's not going to exist? Why do we say, let's give up now, let's not invest, let's move the population, let's abandon all hope? Don't they, as you as an individual, have a right to a meaningful, dignified life for as long as possible? Isn't that the way we should be thinking about climate change? There are all sorts of very strong human rights agreements why the way we approach this issue and the way we frame policy about this issue should be about trying to manage the risks of climate change so that people can live in the Pacific Islands meaningful, dignified lives for as long as possible. We need to plan early. Adaptation needs to happen now to begin to make this work well. If we plan early, adaptation is likely to be effective and it may not necessarily be particularly expensive. And we need to build on the knowledge and capabilities and strengths of these communities to do so. So I think if we think about all these things, vulnerability is socially produced, there is time to adapt. If we think about this problem as a problem about enabling or facilitating people in the Pacific Islands to live meaningful lives for as long as possible, maybe there's room for cautious optimism here. We should not throw our hands in the air and say, there's no hope, there's nothing we can do. There is actually a lot that we can do to reduce social vulnerability, and it's within our control and within our power, theoretically, to do so, and we should be doing that. We should be making sure people have clean water. We should be making sure people have access to basic healthcare. We should be trying to ensure that people all have access to energy and a reasonable level of nutrition and so on. That coastal zone management is working well to provide for resilient and adaptable coastal systems and so on and so on and so forth. There's nothing to stop that from happening. It requires effort and it requires a lot of people to think very carefully and work together very well, but it's possible for adaptation to work. And the more adaptation works, the more time and the more possible it is for people to continue to live meaningful and dignified lives. We have some time to get this right. And the trick here is to make sure that adaptation prolongs the scope for meaningful and dignified lives, to enable then things to continue so that new technologies and new systems and new ways that can help with adaptation may come on board. Technology is revolutionised very quickly, at the same time as allowing enough time for emissions reductions to take effect. If climate can be stabilised at something less than 2 degrees, if adaptation can be effective, there's absolutely no reason why people can't be living in the Pacific Islands for hundreds and hundreds of years to come. And that should be our goal when thinking about climate change policy.